Mr Nobody by Roger Hargreaves. Hello! Meet Mr Happy. Happy by name and happy by nature. And now I'm going to tell you a story. Actually, this isn't a story about Mr Happy. Well, not really. It's about somebody he met not very long ago. Last month, in fact. Mr Happy had been to tea with little Miss Sunshine. He thought about catching a bus to take him home, but as it was such a nice day, he thought again and decided to walk. And he was glad he did. Would you like to know why? I shan't tell you. Not yet, anyway. Mr Happy was whistling to himself as he walked along when he heard a noise. He stopped. There it was again. A sort of sniffing noise. Sniff, sniff, sniff. Suddenly a drop of rain splashed on top of his head. That's odd, he thought to himself, looking up. There isn't a cloud in the sky. And then he couldn't believe his eyes. You'll never guess what Mr Happy saw. There, sitting on the branch of a tree, was somebody who sort of was, but wasn't. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. You could see through him. And he was crying real big, fat, wet tears, which of course were what had splashed on top of Mr Happy's head. Who, Mr Happy managed to splutter, are you? The person who sort of was but wasn't looked mournfully down at him, and in a mournful, melancholy voice replied, Nobody. Nobody? Gasped Mr Happy. But everybody's somebody. The person who sort of was but wasn't sighed deeply. Except me, he said, and he started to cry more real big fat wet tears. Mr Happy scratched his head, which was getting quite wet by this time. Can you get down? He wondered. Possibly, replied Mr Nobody, and he climbed down out of the tree. Where have you come from? Asked Mr Happy. Nowhere. Mr Nobody sighed the sort of sigh that breaks your heart. I know I used to be somebody, but I can't remember who, he sniffed. Or what, he sniffed. Or where, he sniffed. Or when, he sobbed. Mr Happy couldn't help but stare. It isn't often you meet somebody you can see right through. I think, said Mr Happy, that you'd better come home with me. Why? Sobbed Mr Nobody. Because, said Mr Happy, we must do something about you. There's nothing you can do about a nobody, wept the person who sort of was but wasn't. Of course there is, said Mr Happy. Follow me. Eventually they reached Mr Happy's house and went into his living room. Mr Happy pointed to a chair. Sit yourself down, he said. It was really quite extraordinary seeing somebody who was nobody sitting in a chair. Mr Happy sat down too, and thought hard. The wizard! Cried Mr Happy. Of course! So the following morning, after no breakfast, Mr Happy took Mr Nobody to see the wizard. Ah! Remarked the wizard, after Mr Happy had tried to explain. Ah! He said again, eyeing Mr Nobody. Mr Nobody just stood there, looking as glum as anyone can look. Just try turning the corners of your mouth down as far as they will go. Go on. Well, that's about half as glum as Mr Nobody looked. The wizard thought and thought, and thought some more. Care for a cup of tea? He inquired. Nobodies don't drink nothing, replied Mr Nobody. Nobodies don't drink anything, said the wizard, correcting him. That's right, agreed Mr Nobody. Aha! Cried the wizard. That's it. The wizard rushed over to his workbench and started to mix up lots of different coloured liquids in a huge bottle. They bubbled and gurgled together and let off little puffs of white smoke. Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff. Bubble, bubble, gurgle, puff. What colour would you like to be? the wizard asked Mr. Nobody. Nobody's aren't coloured, came the sad reply. You choose, said the wizard, pointing at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy thought. Well, he said, I've always really rather quite enjoyed being yellow. Yellow it shall be, shouted the wizard as he poured more liquid into the bottle. Suddenly, with one huge puff of white smoke, the liquid turned bright yellow. Right, said the wizard, drink that. Nobodies don't drink nothing, said Mr. Nobody. Exactly, shouted the wizard at the top of his voice. Nobodies don't drink nothing. Therefore, nobodies must drink something. Mr. Nobody took hold of the bottle and took a small sip. More, cried the wizard, much more. Mr. Nobody shut his eyes and took a deep breath and swallowed all of the liquid. Mr. Happy and the wizard watched and waited and waited and watched. Nothing happened. Told you so, said Mr. Nobody, and he sighed, another one of those sighs that break your heart. But wait a minute. Did their eyes deceive them, or... They looked at Mr. Nobody's feet. They were turning sort of... Yes, yellow. Yes, decidedly yellow. Definitely yellow. Then Mr. Nobody's legs turned yellow, and then his body, and then his arms. His nose, Mr. Happy shouted. What about his nose? They watched, and they waited, and they waited, and they watched. Nothing happened. Suddenly, Mr. Nobody sneezed, and immediately after he sneezed, with an enormous pop, a tissue pop, his nose turned yellow as well. Oh, I wish you'd been there to see Mr. Nobody's face. His mouth stopped turning down and started turning up, and up, and up, and up again. Well, chuckled Mr. Happy, I told you so. Everybody's a somebody.